Okay, so I feel like a lot of the times when I share stuff that I'm learning on the channel or just in life in general, a lot of it may seem fairly obvious to you, and it may be stuff that people just take for granted that you should just know about life and the world. And unfortunately, I cannot take that for granted because I've been taught so many wrong things in my life that I really have to sit and ponder the things that I think I know about stuff, because it's almost always wrong in fascinating ways. So a good example of this is smart and dumb people. I feel like most people, they would very confidently be able to say, this is what makes someone a smart person, this is what makes someone a dumb person, and that would be easy for them. They would just know. They'd be able to figure that out. But for me, I was raised in a very specific way, and I feel like that has made it a lot harder to evaluate smart and dumb. In my family, right, the way my parents raised us, there were only two kinds of people. You were a smart person or dumb person. These were static states of being. If you were a dumb person, you were always going to be a dumb person. So if, for example, a dumb person were to do something wildly unpredictable and do a smart person thing, there were only two explanations. Either they were always a smart person and they just had been lazy before and weren't meeting their potential. And then if they went back to doing dumb people things, they were just a bad, lazy person. Or it was a fluke. They just lucked into it. They just happened to do a smart person thing. But they were still a dumb person, and they would always be a dumb person. If you were a dumb person, it didn't matter how hard you worked, you were always going to be that kind of person. The same was true of smart people, but it was a different kind of thing, right? Where smart people had this magical thing called potential, right? It's like this sort of space of stuff that they can achieve. And as a smart person, it was your moral imperative to do smart people things and be successful as a smart person, because you owed it, to society and the world and your parents, that you were going to be a smart person and you were going to go do smart people things. So that meant getting a good job, being very financially successful, having a smart, healthy family, right? Those were smart people things, and that's what smart people were supposed to be doing. And the funny thing is, maybe my parents never said this out loud, but I could tell who they thought the smart and dumb people were and how they evaluated what made them smart and dumb. And then I would then use that criteria as well. So, for example, I knew that my grandfather was a smart person because he could do large sums of math in his head. He was a truck dispatcher, so he could manage all kinds of things all at the same time very well. He was very quick-witted, he was very funny, and he was just in general considered an intelligent person. So, interestingly, it was okay that he was a truck driver because he was a third-generation immigrant. So he had a legitimate excuse in my mother's eyes for why he didn't have a smart people job, and it was just such a shame that he couldn't do something else, right? So I think my mom was always a little bit ashamed that he was just a cement truck driver, but he was a smart cement truck driver, so that counted for something. But then, I could see it was with other family members, there was a little less of a kind criteria. My dad had a brother. His brother was very wealthy. He and both his wife made a lot of money. They sent their kids to Ivy League schools. They did very well for themselves financially, so they were smart people, because smart people do smart things and make lots of money. And that was how that was evaluated. My grandmother, she was unfortunately a dumb person, like my mom's mom, because she was a very kind and very helpful person, but she would often help people so much that she would make what my mom estimated were poor choices with my grandfather's money, and she would often help people even past the point where my parents found it unacceptable, because they thought she was being dumb by helping people too much, because it would sometimes be a negative for her. Likewise, okay, so my mom had some brothers. The two oldest brothers, my mom considered them to be smart people. They were very good at school and they did well, but the issue was, okay, so one of them was a bad, lazy smart person when he was in high school, and she always had to mention that just a little bit, because he had this magical thing called potential where he should have, I think my mom expected him to do more. But in my estimation, as an adult, both of my older uncles, they did very well for themselves. They have very happy, healthy families. They're well taken care of. I think they're in a good spot, and they seem to enjoy life very much. Her second brother, he was a smart person, and she considered him to be a good smart person because he did very well in school. He never did poorly. And then he went to college, but then he decided that he wanted to do truck dispatch. And that, I think, to my mom was some sort of moral failing, that he shouldn't have done that because he should have finished college, because as a smart person he had this thing called potential and he should have been using that for something. Whereas the oldest brother, he was a smart person and he had the potential, but he was already a lazy person, so it was okay, and he just had to learn later in life to be a good smart person. So he's fine now, but I could always tell she was a little bit disappointed with them. But interestingly, she had a younger brother who actually reminds me a lot of my brother, and I could tell that my mom had sort of judged him as a sort of like a still a smart person. I don't think my mom is capable of accepting that anybody related to her could be dumb. And I'm not really sure how that computes in her brain. But she was also disappointed in him because he didn't, have a family or do all these other things that she expected of him. But he was also always bad at school. So I think in some ways she was a little bit like less harsh on him for that, because sort of in the back of her mind he was a dumb person. She just didn't want to like admit it in her outside voice. But I could tell she thought it because she talked down about him a lot and all the choices he made and how he was bad with his money. And it was constant, it was constantly like stuff that they would mention when we'd get into the car after family visits, where they'd be like, oh, such a same so-and-so did such and such a thing and didn't do this and this and this. And it was like that with everyone. It didn't matter where we went. It didn't matter who we talked to. It didn't matter if we'd only known them for 30 seconds. We would get back in the car. My parents would have a whole estimation of what kind of person they were and whether they were a smart person or a dumb person and how much value they had as a person. And that was just kind of how it worked. So I sort of learned to do the same thing, right? I would go to school and I'd look at all the children and I would pick the people that I assumed were the smart people to hang out with. And I would go, this is a smart person. So this is the kind of person I should be with because I would like to be a smart person. And it's very important that I be a smart person. So I would evaluate my friends and I'd pick them out. But unfortunately, this led to some issues because sometimes the people that I had decided were smart people were not necessarily good people. And that was another, I think, core thing that I was taught. So my dad, he would say this thing. He would say something absolutely brutal to you, like it was cruel, terrible, make you cry, think about it for the rest of your life. And he'd go, I'm only honest with you because I love you and care about you. No one else is ever going to be as honest with you as I am. And sort of what that taught me is that as long as you were right, you were allowed to be a jerk. So when I was picking friends, I would tolerate a lot of really arrogant, abusive behavior from people, from partners, because they were smart people. And smart people are allowed to be jerks as long as they're right, which I think is something that unfortunately I internalized. So I would also be a jerk to people because I was smart and I was right. And that was the most important thing. But as I got older, I realized there were some things that weren't really adding up with this estimation of how we decided which people were smart and which people were dumb. So for example, when I was talking about the value thing, there was a hierarchy within myself and my sibling where I was smart, but when I got into high school, my grades started dropping and stuff where like I wasn't failing. There was never a point where I was at risk of like failing school. I was in the equivalent of AP classes for the Canadian school system. I was doing fine, but I was doing medium in some classes and extra good in others. So that to my parents was like, you are a smart person, but you're not reaching your potential because you're bad and lazy. At no point was there any consideration. I might have had some sort of learning disability or challenges because I was just a smart person and I just needed to work harder because I clearly wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. But that's okay, because I was smart. So I still had some status in the house, and that gave me certain privileges. My sister, she was considered a smart person, so she also got privileges, but she continued to be good at school all the way through. So she didn't really have any of the negatives, she was just always a smart person, and she was always meeting her potential. So she was probably the best, but most invisible child. Meanwhile, my brother, who I had always considered to be a very smart person. He was very good at memory games, which I was terrible at. I found him very creative and interesting. We had a lot of things in common art-wise, but he was a dumb person. And my parents were very clear about that pretty much from the beginning. By the time he was like 6 years old, they had decided he was a dumb person, and they were deeply upset about it. I could tell that it troubled them an awful lot, that the two smartest people in the whole world had a dumb child. So like the interesting thing is because once you're dumb, you're always dumb. Even when my brother did well at things, he was basically invisible, like he didn't exist to them because he was a dumb person and dumb people don't have any value. So my brother was always at the bottom of the food chain for everything. He always got picked on the most because he was the easiest to make cry. He was just the easiest to bully in general because he was bad at school and all the things my parents thought were important. School was the most important thing. They didn't care if you were happy. They didn't care how good you did in your extracurriculars. To the point where because my brother was bad at school, they would refuse to let him do things he was good at, like drama and art, because it was a distraction from his academics. So my brother was not allowed to have any extracurriculars or other interests because he needed to work extra hard on school because he was that much of a dumb person and it was unacceptable to them. So yeah, that was the hierarchy of how that worked, and that was the hierarchy of how I evaluated whether other people had value to me. Even as a very young child, I would have been probably 13, 14. But then I started to realize things that were very confusing. I noticed that smart people in smart people jobs jobs could be what I saw as very dumb. They would say things that didn't make any sense. You could tell they were making up nonsense. They seemed very unreliable. I would watch like famous smart people and I would realize, wow, they don't really know what they're talking about any more than I do. But that didn't compute, right? Okay, because one of the things my parents valued the most was sort of like an appeal to authority, where if you had a degree or something like that, you were a smart person, you were therefore an authority on everything. I would have very long arguments with my dad where I'd be trying to explain to him things that I knew 100% were true, like that you could do your taxes online, because I had physically done it myself and I knew that I had done it. But he would, every argument would end with something like, your mother and I have 2 degrees and 45 years of experience between the two of us. Are you saying that you know more? So it's kind of like, if you had a degree in something, you were automatically a better, smarter person than anyone else around you. And that was like the metric for that. But then I began to realize that just because people had degrees, that didn't necessarily mean they were smart people. And that was very confusing, because smart people were supposed to go do smart people jobs and have smart people certificates to prove that they were smart people. That was the whole point of the grading system. My parents, the way they explained it when I would get like an 80 and they would be upset about it, and I couldn't understand why, is because the rating system for your grades were infallible. 50, 60, that was like, you did not understand the material, you should not be here, you don't deserve to be here. 70, 80 is like, you did some of the work. And then 100, that was like, you did all the studying, you did all the things you're supposed to. So technically every student, according to my parents, should be capable of straight A's all the time, every subject, didn't matter what it was. So even when I went off to college and I was trying to explain to my dad, no, I have the program I'm in, just because it's a diploma course, it has a 50% dropout rate. It is very challenging, it is very difficult. And that is why I'm not getting 100. But I still want to finish my diploma because I am doing okay. I'm doing like 60s, 70s. My dad was very insistent that he could absolutely do it. He could 100% do the program and he would get 100s on it. And I was like, fine, you should join. You should do it. He didn't. He didn't take me up on it because he already had a smart people. He already was a chemist. So he didn't need to prove that he could do it. He just knew he could, because you can do any subject in the world if you're a smart person. You just need to read enough books. And that was just kind of how that worked. So yeah, I realized that just because people had degrees, it didn't necessarily mean they knew more, which kind of fucked up the whole system of evaluating whether people were smart and reliable or not. I also began to realize that maybe my parents, at least my dad, was not as smart as he thought he was. So one of the only concrete things I had decided for sure was a dumb people thing. It's a sort of like look people get when you're telling them something, where you're like explaining something new to them and they're very averse to it. Like they would rather die than let their brain take in new information. It's sort of like their brain, you can see sort of like a blankness come over their face where they are like, it's like a wild animal in a trap. They would rather die kicking and screaming and yelling and being terribly upset than accept any kind of new information because it's scary and bad. And that to me, I was like, that is the only thing I know for sure is always a dumb people thing. And I could see my dad do it an awful lot whenever new information was given to him. And then I began to think, well, maybe my dad isn't as smart as I thought he was either, which didn't really help because, the whole reason I had accepted how fucking terrible he was to me all the time was because he was a smart person and smart people were allowed to be jerks. But, at a certain point as a teenager, I realized you're only allowed to be a jerk if you're smart. And if my dad is not being smart at the current moment, then he is not allowed to be a jerk, which he did not like very much. And that caused a lot of problems between us. Yeah, then I began to realize that people I had thought were smart and had taught me how to decide who was going to be smart and who's going to be dumb were not necessarily smart people themselves, which was very confusing. I also got to a point where I wasn't sure if I was a smart person because as I became more aware of all the stuff that I didn't know or understand, which was an awful lot of things, I began to realize that I don't know, maybe I'm not a smart person because there seemed to be this different thing between being academically smart and being smart about life and the world. Some people, they just know how to do stuff in the world and they're great at it. They can go to a Mr. Lube shop and they can just understand that you go in the doors and you do the thing and stuff happens and they pay and they leave. But for people like me, there's an awful lot of uncertainty and fear around that experience. And I don't understand what's happening. It's very confusing and I wish someone would give me a manual with all the information in it. Rarely does that happen in real life. So yeah, I began to wonder if I was even a smart person. And if I wasn't a smart person, how would I even know who the smart people were? And I think the thing that kind of clinched it for me was actually, so when I was in high school, I made this friend and I knew he was smart. I could just tell. Okay, so there were just little things where I'd watch. There's this game that he would play. It's this cube brush game, and there's so many complicated things happening in the game at the level he was at, where like things were shifting back and forth very fast, and there's lots of complicated stuff happening and lots of patterns to keep track of, and I didn't understand any of it. There was absolutely no way I would be able to play that game, but he could do it super easily, and I was very impressed by that. That to me, that was an estimation of what a smart person could do, because smart people were capable of doing smart people things very fast, which I was not. I've always really struggled with that. But I knew he was a smart person. I also knew he was a smart person because, he would sit and I would blurt out all my brain thoughts, and there would be many, many of them. And he would just very quietly, he would sit and he would think. And he would go, well, this is what I think. And it was always a very solid and grounded and practical thing that was so much easier than whatever crazy contraption I had made up. So it was almost like I had all these crazy smart people thoughts, but his very simple, normal thoughts were perfectly acceptable and useful, and honestly, very eloquent solutions for problems I was having. So that to me, like, I knew he was a smart person, and I just kind of accepted that. But then he told me he was autistic, and I had to like reevaluate some things because I didn't really understand what autism was or how it worked or what that meant. But I knew he was a smart person, and that was the most important thing. So I was like, yes, okay, you are autistic. But then I brought this boy home as like my boyfriend, and my parents treated him like a piece of furniture because in their estimation, because he was autistic, he was a dumb person, and he would always be a dumb person. So like my dad would never talk to him directly. When I would come home for college to see my siblings, my parents would wait till I was out of the room to cuss and scream at my siblings and tell them they were pieces of garbage, because they knew that I would be upset about it, because I hated when they did things like that. But they would do it in front of him. I don't know, maybe they thought because he was autistic, he would just be like a mute and he wouldn't ever tell me anything. It just wouldn't occur to him. So then I began to realize that maybe my parents' estimate of dumb and smart people wasn't even that reliable because they couldn't judge people accurately at all. Yeah, I really had to rethink about what smart and dumb people meant, especially because when I'd been going through school and teachers would say things like, oh, there are different forms of intelligence. Some people have emotional intelligence. Some people are like good with practical skills. I thought it was pretty common knowledge that was an excuse, because my parents would say like, that's an excuse that dumb people tell themselves to feel better, but you're not allowed to do that because you're a smart person. It was kind of like that with everything. So like even before, I brought an autistic boy home, my mom is a high school teacher. So naturally she's an authority on education because she has a degree in it. She has two actually. She has a degree in, I think, biology and education. So obviously my mom is very smart. She has to be. That's how school works. And anytime she had to supervise the IPP kids, she would come home and she would complain about it and how lazy they were and that they just made excuses. All the ADHD kids were just making excuses. They were all bad, lazy children. And they just needed to work harder. And there was no reason they needed specialized programs or anything. This is right around the time when I was experiencing the most trouble in school. And a lot of the things I was having trouble with were like not understanding social cues and the functions of stuff we were supposed to be doing, getting super distracted and losing things, and having a very hard time keeping all my brain thoughts together in a coherent way. So at no point was there any consideration that like maybe I could be ADHD or anything like that, because that's the dumb kids who made excuses. I wasn't allowed to make an excuse. So I just doubled down and worked very, very hard and still did kind of medium at school, which was unacceptable. So yeah, it went on like that for a while, where little things sort of added up, and I realized that like maybe I'm not right about what makes a smart and a dumb person, because here I am, brain the size of a planet. Love Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So anyways, there I was, one of the smart people, and I would see that these people that I knew would be considered dumb people, according to my parents, knew a lot of stuff that I didn't know about the world in very practical, useful ways. They could do stuff with cars. My dad didn't know anything about cars. I'm sure he thought that he could learn very easily everything he needed to know about cars, but he didn't. And interestingly, like mechanics and trade school, that was a dumb people job. And it was very clear that I wasn't supposed to be in a dumb people job. So like when I went to college, I was burnt out. I was exhausted already. And I had really wanted to do a trade. But interestingly, my dad's excuse is that I wasn't smart enough to do a trade because you needed to do lots of math. But at the same time, it also wouldn't be meeting my potential because I excelled at like English language arts and arts things. So I was very upset. I actually cried about it because I didn't want to go to an art school. I didn't want to do creative things because I was so tired. I was exhausted. I was just so tired of being alive in the world and having to work so hard all the time because I was a smart person. I hated it. I hated every second of it. I just wanted to hang out and have friends and be happy. But that wasn't allowed because smart people have responsibilities. So I was deeply upset about that. But yeah, as I went on, I realized I didn't fucking know shit. So I went to college, and like I could evaluate pretty quickly, like these students are going to be the lazier ones. These are going to be the ones that work harder. And there was like a group of older students, and I figured that they did extra good because they were extra smart. Then I realized that like maybe it's just because they were more mature, you know, like now that I am a more mature person, I'm realizing that as you get older, you just kind of absorb a little bit more of a self-confidence because you've had to go through a lot of shit and you've had to like do a lot of hard work, but you've also had to learn how to work in a smarter way, which is not something I was taught, you know. With my parents, it was very like, you just need to keep grinding and grinding and grinding until there's nothing left of you, because that's how you do things. It had never, I think, occurred to them that you could do things in a smarter way, and it was perfectly acceptable. There was only one way to do everything in the world, and it was in whatever way the smartest person they knew had told them to do it. So when I wanted to write a book, if I wasn't doing it in exactly the way that my dad's friend, who's a very successful author, did it, then it didn't count. You know, if I incorporated a business, it didn't count and was probably illegal because I didn't do it the way that he, a very smart person, did it. And that also continued on for quite a while. So yeah, there I am in college, being miserable, very mediocre, not enjoying anything. But I'm there because that's, you know, my responsibility. I didn't get I didn't go into a degree program, which is a shame because I was not meeting my potential. And honestly, I've like barely made it through the diploma program. It was fucking awful. I would never recommend it to even my worst enemy. I hated it. Hated every second of it. It was garbage. So yeah, there's just lots of things that just weren't adding up for me. Donald Trump, that was another one for me, where he was, by all estimations, a dumb person because like he couldn't string a sentence together. He wasn't very good at communicating. He didn't seem to excel at anything academically ever. But there he was, you know, in a very powerful position, being a president. And I was like, well, how does that make sense? Because a president is a smart people job, and then I started thinking, like, what about con artists? You know, like those are people that are not doing a smart people job, but they're very clever and they're able to come up with these schemes and things that people might not think of, even though a lot of people that run scams are not considered to be intelligent people. And I was like, well, how does that work? What kind of is that? How can a dumb person also be a smart person? That was incomprehensible to me. So I had to think about it for a while, and I finally found this explanation that sort of sums up the things I like sort of knew in the back of my brain about what it means to be a smart person, but I didn't like really know, you know. It was formulating in the back of the brain. So yeah, like a couple months ago, I was looking for something completely different, and I came across this really interesting essay by someone, Carlo Coppola? Chipola? I don't know how to say it, but it's called the Laws of Stupidity, and I don't know if maybe he's a professor or just like an economics person, but he put together this really interesting explanation of intelligent and stupid people, and I really like it because I think it makes a lot more sense than whatever the hell I was taught. So for example, there are 4 kinds of people, and the way that we determine them is actually on a beautiful quadrant chart, which I quite like, where you're evaluating whether that person is able to do things that benefit themselves and others, and whether they cause negatives to themselves or others, which I think is a much more helpful way to look at it. So for example, if you are the kind of person that can do things that benefit other people, but you often don't benefit yourself, you would be a helpless person. So that to me made more sense, because I had always thought that my grandmother was very smart, and I quite liked her, and I found her very kind and wonderful, and I liked that she was helpful to people, and I didn't think it was that terrible that sometimes people took advantage of her, because she was a good, nice lady and she was happy. So I didn't think she was a stupid person, but if there's only 2 kinds of people, what else could she have been? So I kind of like the idea that there's just helpless people, you know, where they do good things for other people, but they don't necessarily know how to benefit themselves. And that's okay. You know, that's just like you're a normal person. Then we had stupid people, which is basically people that don't benefit themselves and don't benefit others. They're generally doing terribly unpredictable, bad things that are bad for everybody, and no one understands why they're doing it, and that makes them kind of dangerous to be around. And that made sense to me, because there were people that were very clearly stupid people that I did not trust and did not want to be around, because I could tell that that it would be bad for me, but I didn't quite understand how to describe that in words. Then you've got this, I really like this one. It's called bandits. So the idea is that sometimes there are people in the world that are smart enough to be able to benefit themselves, but they're not smart enough to benefit other people. So they just take, right? They just con and grift and hurt people because they're just smart enough to do that, but not smart enough to do anything else. And that made sense to me, because I had seen so many people that were running schemes and doing terrible things to other people. And that to me was some kind of cleverness. Like, you had to be sort of clever to figure out how to take advantage of other people. But at the same time, they didn't seem like smart people. And that was a very hard one to put together with my words. And I kind of like the concept of bandits because it does explain, like, why would people that aren't terribly smart end up in positions of power with lots of money for no apparent reason other than they're just selfish? That makes sense. It's a certain kind of smart that is not beneficial to other people. And that made sense to me. And then lastly, we have intelligent people, which are the kind of people that can do things that benefit themselves and others, which also made sense to me. Because one of the things I had never understood about my dad is all the time he would do things that benefit himself all the time. But he had a hard time with the concept of being empathetic towards other people. So when I would express, being concerned or worried about other people, he didn't fully understand it. It wasn't something he was fully able to grasp. And that confused me because I think the smart people that I appreciated the most were the kinds of people that they were doing things that seemed good for everybody, but they were also not doing things that were detrimental to themselves. Because all the time, my dad would ask things of me that would sabotage me, that were bad for me. But the excuse was that I was a smart person and I needed to work hard and do these things that were bad. And yeah, I found it very helpful to think of it that like intelligent people also help themselves, which is not something I had ever really been taught. I was always taught that you needed to do everything for everyone else because it was your responsibility. It had never really occurred to me that part of being a smart person was being able to take care of yourself. And I found that very helpful. And it was a very interesting way of putting that. And yeah, I found this a lot more helpful than the ways that we generally measure intelligence with like tests and stuff. Because there are people I know who I would consider far smarter than me. They're much better at putting their thoughts together. They know a lot more. They can synthesize information a lot better than I can. But they just don't perform well on standardized testing. There are people I know that do great at standardized testing. I'm pretty sure both my parents excelled at school stuff because they were good at standardized testing. But then they would run around doing stupid people things. I didn't understand that. So yeah, I really like this laws of stupidity thing a little bit more. There's actually like 5 laws attached to this. So the very first law is there are always more stupid people in circulation than you expect. Which, when I think about it, I can kind of see that. Because one of the things that's always baffled me is, when I talk to people in general, I'm like, yes, this is a very smart, normal person. I have a lot of faith, I think, that most people in the world are smart, intelligent, kind people. But then occasionally, someone will just out of left field throw something at you, and you'll be like, how is this possible? And it's almost always on the internet. It's always, I think it's just something about like not being able to see other people that allows people with crazy thoughts in their brains to just put the crazy thoughts out there for everyone. And, like I worry, it makes me worry about the world. But when I think about it, it also makes me feel a little bit better, because if there's always been more stupid people than we thought there were, just all the time, we're probably at about the same level of stupid people that we have always been at. And that's probably okay. Like TikTok, I see people going all the time like, oh, the TikTok is ruined to use and they're all extra dumb. But I wonder if that's just because the dumb people are more visible. And now we know that, now we're like, wow, there really were more stupid people than we thought there were. The law is proven. Okay, so the second law is the probability that a certain person who is stupid is independent of any other characteristic of that person, which again also I found very helpful, because a lot of the ways that my parents assessed whether someone was smart or not depended entirely on their income level and how successful my parents assumed them to be. Finances was a huge part of whether someone was smart or stupid and whether they had reached their magical potential. So I kind of like this idea that your smart or dumbness is completely unrelated to, your race or your nationality or your education level or your income. Because that to me makes a lot more sense, because I feel like I've seen so many people that aren't terribly smart people that are doing things that are negative for themselves and others just all the time, and somehow they are very wealthy and successful, so they should technically, by my parents' estimation, be smart people. Yeah, law 3, I guess I talked about it a little bit, is a stupid person is a person who causes losses to another person or to a group of persons while also getting no gain and possibly incurring losses, which makes sense to me, because if I think about concrete examples of people that we all agree are stupid, it's generally people doing things that are dangerous to themselves and others for no apparent reason. They're just doing strange irresponsible thing. But the one thing I like the most is that this isn't a static state of being, right? Sometimes people are helpless. Sometimes people are the bandits. Sometimes people are the stupid person. Sometimes they're the intelligent person. But the interesting thing is, okay, so like in this estimation, almost every other role is switchable. Sometimes you're helpless, sometimes you're intelligent, sometimes you're a bandit. But stupid people are almost always stupid. Which I kind of like also, because I feel like the people I trust the least in the world are people that are consistently dangerous and irresponsible and arrogant. That to me is the thing that I was always like, yeah, that does seem like a stupid people thing. If you're like incapable of absorbing new information and you're often doing things that are like bad for you and other people for no apparent reason consistent, that would make you a stupid person. And that to me, that made sense. But then there were all these people that weren't necessarily like that all the time, you know, just sometimes they would maybe make a poor choice that was bad, or they would do something that was kind of mean to someone else, which was a form of cleverness. And I'd never really understood how to estimate that. And I don't know, I just really like that as an explanation. So I don't know if this is interesting or terribly boring. But yeah, that's kind of the best example I can give of what it was like in my brain growing up and how I understood the value of people. Because yeah, there were so many things I didn't fully understand that I could see with my eyes and in my brain that just weren't adding up. The fact that my parents, you know, like once you were a stupid person, you were basically invisible. Once they decided you were dumb, you had no value, which didn't make sense to me because there were so many people in the world that would be considered dumb people to my parents that had very valuable skills that they did not have, like being a mechanic. People that had access to resources that I did not have personally. There were all these people in the world that had very practical, useful assets that came along with knowing them as people, or like different ways of thinking that were very valuable, and they were somehow considered not worth knowing and not worth associating with, which didn't really make sense to me. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you take for granted that you know what makes someone smart or dumb, and maybe this all seems very basic to you and you can't understand why this is something I actively had to think about. But for me, you know, it's something that I would like to be better at understanding, because I think one of the real pitfalls for me personally is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking you are always the smart person in the room and you know the most. That was how I was raised. That was how my dad behaved. That was how he expected other smart people to behave. And it was just a natural given that smart people were allowed to be jerks to everybody else because they were just right all the time. And that was just how that was supposed to work, which I think was very detrimental. It made it hard for me to have healthy relationships. You know, I treated people very poorly, especially people I cared about. You know, I still sometimes notice little thought patterns in my brain that'll emerge when I'm evaluating someone, where I will like give someone a little too much leeway when they are being arrogant or mean because they're a smart person. Or I will maybe talk down to people or be rude to them because I just don't think they're a smart person. And, you know, that's something I've got to work on. But I find it interesting to learn about and at least see that, like, someone else has thought about it a little bit, you know? Like, this is an essay that a real person made with their real time and probably a real degree. And I really like that. So yeah, that was all I wanted to share today.